By we, I suppose I mean the Chester Christian Aid Committee and the St Mary's team are so glad you're here this evening. Thank you for coming. And for those of you on Zoom, we're so glad you're there. Thank you. With Holy Week and Easter, we come to the heart of it all, to the very heart of God. Every year we tell the same stories of a man's arrest, of fear and brutality in high places, of beatings and abuse, of that man's dying in excruciating pain. I choose my words carefully. And then of an event wrapped tight in mystery, when some of his women disciples go to his tomb expecting the stench of death and instead catch the scent of angels. And when, wonder of wonders, they meet him again and find themselves deep in the presence of God. How to make such familiar stories strange, as if we're hearing them for the first time. How to touch their reality and make it our own. That is the task of the preacher at this time of year. In the 80s and early 90s, I taught at a theological college in Salisbury, and sometimes in my preaching turned to storytelling or poetry, composing a sermon in the form of a story or a poem. And when I was appointed to a post at the cathedral across the river here in Chester, I continued that as an occasional practice. And between 1992 and 2012, I had 6 collections of my pieces published, and I'll be drawing on 4 of those this evening. I've chosen 7 Passiontide pieces, and they will be joined together with wonderful music, chosen and performed by Michael Reynolds and Sarah Jessop, who've already been introduced to you. One of the purposes of this evening is to raise funds for Christian Aid, as you know. Last time we held an evening like this in December, people were extraordinarily generous, and if you can donate again, that would be marvellous. Christian Aid envelopes are on the seats for those of you here in person, and please think about gift aiding, or the committee will set our treasurer upon you. While for those attending in Zoom, we've set up a Tap Simple page, or you can send a cheque to us here at St Mary's. Some of you have donated already. Thank you. So let us begin with a poem that ranges widely through the stories of Jesus' passion and death, and some events that precede his arrest, and which also takes us back to 2 sparkling stories in Genesis. I first preached this piece in Chester Cathedral on a Maundy Thursday, when the focus was on John's astonishing story of Jesus washing the feet of his friends. We clergy, as clergy often do on a Maundy Thursday, acted out the story by washing the feet of some members of the congregation. When we'd done that at the Theological College in Salisbury, we'd done it properly. In Chester Cathedral, it was more of a token ritual. I didn't realize that the first time, and I got into a bit of trouble for taking too much time and using too much soap. From keeping God company, the foot washing. From here, there is no going back. We are drawn inexorably to Golgotha. A few moments and we will be there, pulled by our annual fascination with this man's death, driven by our longing for salvation, the need to know we are saved, safe, and loved to the bitter end. A few moments and Jesus will be there also, for the Son of God will be strung up high, pinned tight for all to see. But first some stories must be told, a few things must be done, and we must watch and listen and let God touch our souls. First, the Son of God must come near to breaking point among the shining olives of Gethsemane. First, he must be embraced and kissed by an old comrade, an expensive kiss, 30 pieces of silver. First, he must be arrested, taken for trial, thrown into the deep end of men's power games, kicked between a mob baying for crucifixion, clever men trying to keep their hands clean, and soldiers using him as their prey for their own beloved brand of blood sport. First, he must be denied by another friend, once, twice, 3 times, and a cock must crow. First, he must be abandoned by all but a few women, and alone in John, the disciple who means so much. Before that, an unnamed woman must anoint him Messiah in the house of Simon the leper. She must do what the high priest should have done long ago. A leper's house in Bethany must serve for the anointing of the Son of God, when only the fine, grand temple in Jerusalem was good enough for the rest of David's kings. That unnamed woman must prepare the Son of God for his enthronement. She will do her job well. She will pour the perfume of her love all over his head. The soldiers will see to the crowning and the placing on the throne. They too will do their job well, alas. But first of all in John, the Son of God must teach his friends a parable. He must take off the clothes of a rabbi and put on the towel of a slave, kneel beside a bowl of water and wash feet clean from the world's dirt, make them tingle, bring a shine to the skin. To wash a rabbi's feet is an act of love. To wash disciples' feet is to set love free from all convention and let it roam the whole wide world. When God came in disguise to ancient Abraham, with 2 companions trailing behind them the light of heaven and all the hope Sarah and Abraham longed for, Abraham did not wash his feet. "Let a little water be fetched," he said, "and wash your feet." Those were all the courtesies entertaining God unawares demanded then. But now the Son of God does the washing. Such are the courtesies of Golgotha. Such is the etiquette of heaven. Jesus is not play acting here. This particular parable is for real, like the pilgrimage to Golgotha along the Via Dolorosa and the pain at that journey's end. There is no pretending here. God had a towel round his waist when he made the world, a potter's apron tied around him when he knelt in Eden to puff the life into the first human being, a surgeon's gown when he took that creature's side and made a woman. He has never lorded it over us, and never will. He always treats us like royalty. Go to Golgotha, and we will see. another poem, one I wrote for Chester Secondary School and their end-of-term service in the cathedral. It begins in Bethlehem, and in a few lines moves through Jesus' ministry and then ends at Golgotha. Its best line is the last. I nicked it from Exodus 32:11 and a literal translation of the Hebrew. The students were going to begin their Easter holidays as soon as the service was over, so I kept the poem short. The three faces of Christ. What you must first understand about the face of Jesus is that it is so small. He has no hair yet. His milk teeth are not yet showing beneath his gums. His lungs are well developed, as Mary and Joseph and the animals have already discovered, but he has no language beyond his crying. He, the Word of God, cannot say Mama. He, the Son of God, cannot call him Abba, let alone argue with rabbis and priests in the temple the finer things of heaven. He is the love of God, and yet he cannot smile, though sometimes when he gets the wind, his face crumples up as though he can. His eyes cannot focus, and yet, if you kneel beside his manger, you will be far too high above him if you stand. If you kneel so that your face is close to his, then you will find yourself looking level-eyed into the face of God. A second feature of his face to have imprinted on your soul, the laughter lines that play about his eyes. Some keep their Christ pickled in piety, or paint him stern as a schoolmaster in Dickens on a bad day, unbending, uncompromising, unforgiving. Why, then, is he such good company? Why does he tell such stories? Why does he teach the lame not just to walk, but dance the tango? Why does he turn water into wine and speak of living life to the full? Why does he bend so low, this unbending man, that he can wash disciples' feet? Why will he always compromise if that means touching someone in their need? Why is forgiveness his Alpha and Omega, his beginning, his middle, and his end? Why does he fill his own tomb with such merriment that we can only call it resurrection? See, his whole face dances with the laughter lines of God. The third marking of his face you cannot miss. I mean the pain, the bewilderment, the sorrow, the sheer anguish of it. Such is the expression we have left him with. Now we have strung him up on that heavy crossbeam he's lugged along these narrow streets to Golgotha. He will die with it. His hair is hidden behind black thorns. His teeth are gone, knocked out in the beating the soldiers have given him. His lungs rasp for breath and soon will lose the fight. We have robbed him of his language too, left him just a few last words with which to hurl his loneliness at heaven. He cannot smile, for we have wiped all smiling off his face. His eyes can hardly see for pain. And yet, if you stand yourself beneath his cross, oh, do not kneel or bend your head, but raise your eyes and see. If you stand on very tiptoe, then you will find to your great sorrow but his small comfort, that you can reach to soothe the very face of God. The Gospels go out of their way to shift the blame for Jesus' death from the Roman authorities to the Jewish religious leaders and the Jewish crowd. We understand why they did so. If the Christian movement were in its infancy today and we told a story of our founder having been imprisoned at Guantanamo Bay and dying there, you can imagine the assumptions people would make and the alarm it would cause. In the Roman Empire of the first century, similar prejudice and fear was stirred up by the story of Jesus being crucified by the Roman governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate. Crucifixion was the Roman punishment meted out to non-citizens who threatened the state. So the gospel writers, especially Matthew, turned Pilate into a reluctant executioner and told of him washing his hands of the affair, of his wife attempting to intervene, of his offering to release Jesus, and of his giving in to the demands of the crowd and setting free a notorious prisoner called Barabbas instead. We know from other sources that the real Pontius Pilate was very different. Philo of Alexandria, a contemporary of his, describes him as merciless, obstinate, corrupt, insolent, and cruel, and speaks of his continual murders of people untried and uncondemned, and his never-ending and gratuitous and most grievous inhumanity. This next poem and another monologue, which we will hear later, owe more to Philo's assessment of Pilate's character than to Matthew's. You see, we need to set the record straight. Crucifixion was a Roman form of execution. It was Pilate who crucified Jesus, not the Jews. They were not the Christ killers. Brother God, in Monty Python's Life of Brian, Pontius Pilate is a buffoon, a nice buffoon, played by Michael Palin, who couldn't play a nasty one if he tried. He has the crowd rolling on the floor in unrestrained hilarity. The Pilate Jesus faced was hard as nails, infamous for his brutality, all the swagger of Roman might held in his one person with Roman dread of insurrection. It is the time of Passover, the worst time of the year for a Roman governor of Judea, when Jerusalem is far too full of people, all come to hear again their ancient tale of the slaying of sea dragons and the drowning of soldiers, their chariots and their king. For Egypt, read Rome, and you catch at once the stink of Pilate's fear. It only takes one to start a fire, and the whole city will be ablaze. Stamp out the flames before they take hold. If anyone calls himself a king or is proclaimed so, then get him quick, get him. Thrash him to an inch of his life, then take it. Take the rest, and make his death a spectacle for others to tremble at. Make it as degrading, as humiliating, as disgusting as possible. Let that be Rome's lesson for the day, so these Jews can still have their Passover, but know it is but a foolish pretense, for Rome is stronger than Egypt and will never be drowned in anyone's Red Sea. Some began to spit on him, blindfold his face, strike him, mock him. The guards took him then for their beatings. So we are told. All that before he reaches Pilate and the headquarters of Rome. So now we know what to hold in our mind's eye, the state he is in. He stands before Pilate covered in blood, bruises, spittle. Pilate looks him up and down, a wretched little Jew in his filthy striped pajamas, with his swollen face, teeth already knocked out of him. He turns, looks out of the window at the restless crowd below, and asks his question, the old question of his power and his fear. Are you the King of the Jews? Are you the King of the Jews? He laughs out loud. It matters not how this upstart Jew with his broad peasant face, his calloused feet and battered flesh, it matters not how he will answer. There is only one place for a man they call King of the Jews, and that is a Roman cross. He faces him again. Why does he find it so hard to look him in the eye and hold his gaze? He glances at him, knows in that instant he can never humiliate him. The man will always have another cheek to turn, will never lose his dignity. He is too close to divinity for comfort. And that is too dangerous a thought for anyone to entertain. Rome's vast empire has room for only one divine Caesar at a time. Two is most decidedly a crowd. Damn him. Crucify him. Put a placard on his cross. Tell the world that this apology for a dog, let alone a man, is the King of the Jews. Send word to Matthew's Magi. Let them come from the east a second time. Let them make haste once more to Jerusalem, this time to Golgotha, to find what they were looking for those many years ago, the one born King of the Jews. Let them come to Golgotha and see. And if they come all that way, will they dare to look? And will we dare to look? Will we dare to look him in the eye and hold his gaze? Dare we see the tears of God? And will we call him king or brother? All the Gospels speak of women followers of Jesus witnessing his death. They name some of them, but all of them say there were others there also. When you listen to the next piece, you have to remember that for years I taught Old Testament studies and was captivated by its stories of Eve and Sarah and Job and the like. I still am. In fact, I think I probably wrote this piece when I was at Salisbury. I've let my imagination run wild here. I've turned Eve into a goddess for a start. That's not what Genesis does, though when it calls her mother of all that lives, it gives her a title fit for one. Abraham's wife Sarah is presented in Genesis as a holy, tragic character, and that I've built upon. When Abraham goes off in Genesis 22 to sacrifice their son Isaac, he says nothing whatever to Sarah. And when at the last second Isaac is spared the knife, Abraham returns home without his son. Then we are told Sarah dies, no doubt of a broken heart. The Sarah in my story does not die, though her heart is broken all right. As for Job's wife in the book of Job, she's caught up in all the disasters that befall the family at the beginning of that great tale as much as he is. Yet while Job is allowed to rail at God for over 16 chapters, his wife is given nothing to say to God at all, and but 2 lines to say to her husband. How long will you go on clinging to your innocence? Curse God and die. I have brought her to the cross too, so she can cry those words once more and this time be heard. In the book of Job, she's not even given a name. I have called her Mara, which in the Hebrew means bitter. It's the name Naomi takes for herself in the book of Ruth when she returns from Moab, having lost her husband and her sons. Storytelling, you see, can allow you to take enormous liberties. And there's one more liberty I take at the very end, the greatest of them all. I'm not telling, you'll have to listen for it. The other women. There were other women at the cross beyond those of whom the Gospels speak. They came unseen by all but Christ himself, and only he heard their words or felt them wash the blood from his feet with their tears. They were his last and most abiding companions. Eve came, mother of all that lives. Her name was fit for a goddess, and she came to meet the Christ on Golgotha with all her grandest ceremony. Her hair streamed out behind her in the wind of the world's first making, and her eyes shone with the light of the first stars. Walking the hills of Galilee with Christ, she had found again her ancient freedom and her dignity. With him there had been much work to be done. She was the mother of all that lives, and there had been much death to defeat. But she no longer had to endure the toil that had always threatened to bend her body or break her spirits. With Christ she had discovered her old courage also and daring. There had been no cause to hide anymore. She'd been able to face anything, and face it she had. And with Christ, she had grown wise. He had given her the fruit of the tree of knowledge. And in his hands it had brought not fear and shame as before, but delight and power and new wisdom. She had turned into the queen she was always meant to be. And her merriment had spilled over the Sea of Galilee and made the fish leap. And so she came to Golgotha, holding the sun in her hand, ropes of flowers wound round her tall neck, and the jewels of the deep earth upon her fingers. But it was not as she expected. She had come for the coronation of her king, to cry Amen, to sing for him the love song of creation and lead him in the dance of Eden. But it was not as she expected. The sun in her hand went black. The jewels on her fingers lost their light, and the flowers about her neck closed their petals. She had to change her song. It was still a love song, but not the one that she had sung at creation. It was the song she'd sung after the flood, when all the world had been drowned in God's tears. She'd sung it then to console him, and so now she sung it again at the foot of the cross. And she laid the black sun there, and took her garlands of flowers and put them about his neck, and slipped her jewels on his twisted fingers. And she kissed him and wept. Sarah was there also. Isaac had never come home. He'd gone off one morning with his father, and she'd never seen him again. Abraham had talked wild talk of a 3-day journey of fire and a knife, and the building of an altar and the binding of her son, of how he had stopped and sacrificed a ram instead, and all she'd asked was where Isaac was. He'd not been able to tell her, so she had left and gone hunting for him. She'd gone back to Ur, from where they'd come originally, but Isaac was not there. She'd gone down to Egypt, where once Abraham had so humiliated her, but they'd heard nothing of her son. Christ had first discovered her among some tombs above the Sea of Galilee, where she'd gone to see if Isaac's name was on any of the graves. Wild with grief, she'd called Christ all the names under the sun and beaten his chest with her fists, and he had waited till she was done and could accept his embrace. She'd kept him company ever since. So she came to Golgotha and waited till he died. And when they came to take his body down, she sat on the ground and asked them to lay his body in her lap. And so they did. And she bent her face to his and said over and over again, "My son, my son, my son, my son." Three other women were there at the cross beyond those of whom the Gospels speak. The third was Job's wife, Mara she was called. She'd happened to be on the edge of the crowd as Christ had entered Jerusalem. She'd watched the people as they'd carpeted his way with branches of palm. She'd listened to their coronation songs. She'd followed him to the temple and seen the mayhem he had caused. She'd listened at the foot of some steps leading to an upper room. She had watched as he broke down in Gethsemane, as he was arrested with the kiss of a friend, as he was tried and tried again. She'd heard his screams as the soldiers put him to the lash. She'd followed him all the way to that strange hump of cracked rock above a rubbish dump outside the city walls. All that time she had said nothing. She'd not seen those moments when Christ had looked at her. He knew who she was and why she was there. But she had never looked him in the eye, and she did not understand herself what she was doing. But when they nailed him to the wood, and the cries of agony broke from his throat, and the fighting for breath began, and the hopeless clinging on to life and its terrible pain, then she understood. And she came out of the shadows where she had been standing, and she stood right in front of the cross and called up to Christ to gain his attention. "How long will you go on clinging to your innocence?" she shouted. "Curse God and die! Curse God and die!" There was silence. The onlookers stopped their mockery and waited. The thief who'd been shouting at Christ for so long was quiet. For a third time, Mara shouted, "Curse God and die!" Christ's body twisted and pulled at the nails. He seemed to be gathering all his strength for one last effort. Slowly, he lifted his head. My God, why have you abandoned me? Why? His voice seemed to split heaven in two. A fearful darkness fell upon the place. The earth shuddered and broke apart, and all those beneath the cross were thrown to the ground, all except Mara. She stood there, stock still. She remembered the time when she and her husband Job had suffered so very terribly, and she recalled how insufferable he'd been at first, until the dam of his piety had burst, and he had dared for the first time in his life to look God in the eye and tell him what was in his heart. In the end, his God had come out of hiding and taken him by the hand and shown him all the secrets of the universe, and that, of course, had changed him quite. But Mara had not received the vision herself. There had been no grand tour for her. She'd not heard God's exquisite commentary. For her there'd been no end, no conclusion, only a loneliness and a bewilderment which all Job's new love had not been able to penetrate. And there she was on Golgotha, and once again she'd cried those terrible words, "Curse God and die," only this time she had not been rebuked. This time the man had had no dam of frightened piety to break. This time she'd been listened to, her words had been heeded. Yet that was not why she was weeping. She was weeping because she knew what Christ's words meant. She had heard her husband shouting at God, beating at God's door with his own terrifying words, and she'd not known till then that he had loved God so much, nor put so much trust in his mercy. Now on Golgotha, when she heard Christ's bitterness burst from his body, she recognized it at once as the cry of the lover to the beloved. She knew the quaking earth was deceived, for there was no cause for fear. Christ had looked God in the eye and shown him his heart. All was revealed. For the first time, she herself saw the love at the heart of God. Her husband had told her of it, told her of what he'd seen and heard, but she had only heard by the hearing of the ear. She'd not seen, she'd not known for herself, not till that moment when Christ raised his head and bellowed out his pain. She stepped forward and laid her head on his feet. The last thing he knew before he died was her tears mingling with his blood. He wanted to give her a new name, for Mara, bitter, no longer spoke of her. But he could not find the breath. It died on his lips. Yet it would not be long before he would meet her again, walking in his garden in the cool of the new day. Then he would call her Mary, and she would find resurrection. In 2010, the year I retired from the cathedral, I wrote a number of pieces for a Good Friday service in Chester Cathedral, 3 of them from the other side. You'll soon see what I mean. This was the first of them. It's a monologue, all my words being put into Pilate's mouth. It's simply called Pilate. How dare you sit in judgment upon me? What would you have done in my position? Tell me that. We'd been keeping an eye on him for a long time. He was very popular. What would he do with such popularity? Some started calling him their Messiah, their new king. We don't need another king. One emperor is enough. Others called him Lord, Saviour, Son of God. That's high treason. The emperor bears those titles. Only the emperor can bear those titles. And he was giving people ideas above their station too, so I heard, not observing proper boundaries. What would they want next? What would he want next? I was kept fully informed, so I knew full well that he was coming to Jerusalem for the Passover. I heard later about his grand procession through Jericho and the crowd lining the streets, and his asking to lodge for the night in the house of one of our chief tax collectors. I couldn't understand that. Not the way for a Jewish popular leader to retain his precious following, paying such honor to someone like that. The man was clearly a fool. When he got to Jerusalem, his folly was astonishing. As he was walking up through the dry Judean hills with that motley crowd bleating behind him, I was riding with my soldiers from Caesarea and the lush fields of the coastal plain. This wretched Passover. Caesarea was civilized. Herod had done a proper job when he built it. Harbour, amphitheatre, hippodrome, colonnaded streets, aqueduct, a temple to the divine Caesar, fine statues, sea breezes thrown in for good measure. All you need. Jerusalem was a nightmare with its narrow, winding streets and its religion. Its religion, far too much of it at the best of times, and Passover was the worst. What were we Romans to make of its temple? Herod had built that too, or started it at least. The work was still going on. It was vast. At least its platform, its gold and shining marble walls would blind you in the midday sun, and in the middle of it, a little house for their God. I couldn't fathom its contradictions. It was built to the glory of Herod. That was plain enough. What would the Jews think of it? Would they suppose it was for their glory too? The tales they told were dangerous, especially at Passover, all about being under the thumb of Egypt and its Pharaoh and their God bringing them out into freedom, clearing away the waters of the Red Sea that blocked their path, and letting them surge back again over the heads of the Egyptian soldiers pursuing them. I will gain glory for myself over Pharaoh and all his army, his chariots and chariot drivers, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. The absurd boast of an absurd little God. But the Jews believed it came true. An entire Egyptian army wiped out, and the women with their tambourines leading their ancestors in a wild victory dance on the far shore. That's the story they told every Passover. I didn't need to be a philosopher to work it out, nor did they. And that's why I rode up from Caesarea to Jerusalem for the Passover every year with enough soldiers to fill the Antonia fortress to bursting. From there we could look down on the courts of the Jews' temple and come running straight away if there was any trouble. It was a fine procession into the city we had. Drums beating, swords and spears flashing, the eagles of Rome held aloft to catch the rays of the sun. I looked down on it all from my snorting horse. The people in the streets were suitably subdued. The children hid behind their mothers' skirts. No one dared raise so much as a fist to us. They knew well what we would have done if they had. Then one of my centurions brought me a disturbing report. That little peasant from Galilee had mocked me. If not to my face, then right out in the open. He'd borrowed a donkey, saying he would give it back when he'd finished with it, and then he'd ridden into the city from the east, just as I was riding in from the west. This was deliberate mockery, carefully planned, so the centurion told me. The people loved it, sir, he said. I bet they did. Worse was to come. He took the lame and the blind into the temple, which was against his own religion, a flagrant violation of the rules laid down in his own sacred scrolls. I said the man was a fool, but then he went stark raving mad, started overturning everything, money everywhere, baskets of pigeons broken open and the birds flying free and the sellers shouting, and he stopped the priests and the Levites carrying their precious vessels through the precincts. He was disrupting the entire operation, with Passover almost begun, and the temple and the whole city crammed full of pilgrims. What would you have done? The same as me. Sent in the soldiers at a run and the Jewish temple police stomping behind them. And when he disappeared, taken any means necessary to find him and arrest him, then crucifixion as an example to others. Caiaphas got it right. It is better for you to have one man die for the people than to have the whole nation destroyed. Exactly. If I hadn't intervened and killed Jesus, how many others would have died? He would have started a riot, if not a revolution. And if I'd let him carry on, the towns and villages and the whole countryside could have been caught up in it. He could have started a war. I would have lost good men, and you would have had your women raped and your children burned alive or skewered on our spears. Would you have preferred that? I nipped it in the bud, did what I had to do, what any man in my position would have done. If you think otherwise, then you're as big a fool as he was. And don't give me those tales about washing my hands and my wife telling me he was innocent. As for saying I released Barabbas, I am Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea, keeping the peace for my emperor in a particularly troublesome part of his empire. I don't release Barabbases. I get rid of them, like Jesus is of Nazareth, to keep the peace, to keep people happy, to keep my emperor happy, and to keep the gods happy too, if they've got any sense. If you ever get your own empire, you'll be just the same. And now, for something completely different, as they say, something much quieter, you'll be glad to hear, perhaps, much more positive in tone and content, a short meditation on Christ's death, which begins with a famous line from T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets, and which takes its title from John's Gospel, from John chapter 19, verse 30. It is finished. Humankind, the poet said, cannot bear very much reality. Yet things catch up on us, of course, rise from troubled depths to trouble us. The mist of our pretense clears, and moments come too hard and sharp when we neglect to fool ourselves. Then we need a safe place where we will not be judged but understood. We do not need another scorn. We need compassion. When truth rises up and breaks the surface of our pretending, we do not need our failings or our failures pointed out and underlined. We need a reminder of our worth, a new impression of our dignity, so we can laugh at ourselves with laughter that is merry and without mockery. Too many of us believe we cannot attain even to mediocrity, for we are measured by what we have achieved and told our very worth depends on it. The air sits heavy with our disappointment. Bereavement and grief for the end of relationship knock the stuffing out of us. The guilt so often left behind, the anxiety, the emptiness, the noiseless house to return to, the silent evenings, the having no one now to tell about our day, no one to share our fears, the home that is no longer quite itself. These can sap our confidence, seek to undermine our worth. Persistent pain or chronic fear can do the same, and loneliness also. Being other people's outcasts, living perpetually on the edge of things, being not loved for all we are worth, feeling we are not loved at all. These most surely do it, persuade us we count for little or nothing. Yet that is a lie. It is not true, not true, not true. See here. Here on this cross is a man in pain. Here is a man alone. Here is a man who faced arrest among the black olives of Gethsemane and almost broke apart with fear. Here is a man cast out, taken outside the walls for execution, lest he contaminate the holy city by his dying. Here is a man overcome by loss, drowning in the last moment of his agony in the silence of God. And what in all this had he achieved? This man carried the humanity of us all and still bears its load. And this man shows us God. See here. Here on this cross, we see God outcast, God in pain, God unloved, God alone, God sorely grieved. Yet here is God with arms stretched wide for our embrace. Here fall heaven's tears of love. Here we catch the beating of God's heart. Here is God's generosity displayed, and here his victory unfurled. For God is not defeated here. Love wins this day and must win every day. Nothing can confound the love of God. Nothing deflect it from its course or stem its flow. So here in the shadow of this cross we are not alone. Here our grief and pain are understood, shared, cherished. Here is healing for our torn souls. Here where terror might seem to hold such sway we have no cause to fear. Here we are loved, loved still more, loved eternally with a love that has no flaw, that will not let us down, that is as large and larger than the universe, as bright as a kingfisher's back in the summer's sun, as strong and relentless as the crash of the sea. We are worth something here. We are worth everything here. Let us care for one another. Mary of Magdala emerges from the Gospels as the disciple most devoted to Jesus, the one who would follow him to hell and high water and never let him go. Yet she has only one real story to her name, the one in John 20 where she meets the risen Christ. Luke tells us in the middle of his gospel that she was healed by Jesus of possession by 7 demons. Such first century language suggests she was most seriously ill when Jesus first met her. Luke doesn't elaborate, so I have. Everything I describe in this story of Mary's girlhood and marriage, I have invented. I've turned Mary into the narrator so she can tell her story for herself. You'll have to forgive my male voice. This piece also goes through some dark places, but in the end it emerges into the light of resurrection with a gentle, halting Alleluia. Teaching God to dance. When I was a girl in Magdala, my mother told me ancient stories of God and my people, the Jews. One began like this. And it happened after these things that God tested Abraham, and he said to him, Abraham, and he said, Here I am. And he said, Take, pray, your son, your only one whom you love, Isaac, and offer him up as a burnt offering. I hated that story. I thought its God was a monster. What about Sarah? I asked my mother. Did God ask her to go as well? No, my mother replied. Why not? Because you will learn why in due time, Mary. You mean it was because she was a woman and women don't count? You're too old for your years, Mary, my mother said. Another night she told me the story of Moses and the burning bush. Only a bush, I said, not a great tree. I thought gods had sacred trees, not bushes. Does that mean our God was not big enough to have a tree, only a stupid bush? My mother looked at me. Only the God of all the universe would be content with a bush, she replied. I may have been too old for my years, but I didn't understand that. And God called to him, she continued, from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. And then he said, Come no closer here, take off your sandals from your feet, for the place you're standing on is holy ground. But Moses was married to Zipporah at the time, I interrupted. Tell me a story about God saying to Zipporah, Zipporah, Zipporah. There isn't one, my mother said. Might have guessed, I said. And when it came to the story of the boy Samuel, and God waking him in the night over and over with his Samuel, Samuel, I'd had enough. I don't want to know, I said. When I grew up and started my periods and got married to a rich man with lots of slaves and animals and barns not big enough for his harvests, I learned afresh that women didn't count. He hit me on our wedding night. He hit me every night. And every night he raped me. There's no other word for it. And when, to my despair, I found myself pregnant with his child and couldn't hide it from him anymore, he shouted, Why didn't you tell me? Are you ashamed of it? It's a girl, is it? Is that it? A filth of a girl curled up inside you. Well, we'll see about that. And he kicked me in the stomach and kept kicking me until he'd finished. and the child inside me was dead. He divorced me after that because I couldn't have children anymore and was incapable of giving him a son. And that is why when Jesus came to Magdala, he found me mad. My family were ashamed of me and had shut me in a small windowless room, never allowing me out. They even gave up using my name. I crouched in the corner of that room, swaying back and forth, or else I danced, a slow, awkward, gangly dance that got faster and faster until I would fall on the floor exhausted. Jesus of Nazareth found me in that room. I was dancing. "Don't touch me!" I shouted. He waited and waited. Waited till I fell in a heap at his feet. "Mary," he said. And then, after a long pause and very quietly, "Follow me." And so I did, of course. From village to city to grand temple to crucifixion to death to burial. Then there was nothing I could do for him anymore, except dance. That is why I went to the tomb to dance for him outside. He wouldn't be able to see, of course. The stone would be between us, and in any case he was dead. But I would dance and dance and dance until I fell exhausted to the ground, and then I would hope for death to come to me too, so we could be together, him and me. But he wasn't in the tomb. It was full of angels instead. No room for him. I was in a different world. Somewhere along the path through the garden, I'd crossed the line between earth and heaven, between the empire of Tiberius and the kingdom of God. But I hadn't seen it. It was still dark, I suppose, though that seems a feeble excuse. I was blind with grief. That's a better one, I guess. In this new world of God, dead bodies were replaced by angels. Only I didn't want angels. I wanted him. "They've taken him away," I cried. I didn't know who they were, but they must have put him somewhere, and I wanted to find out so I could go and pick him up and hold him in my arms, as once in that small, dark, fetid room in Magdala, he'd held me till my madness had gone and I had found my sanity. "Mary," he had said. Now I would hold him and call his name over and over, and it would do no good, but I'd be able to say there was nothing more I could have done and try once more, or one day, to kid myself out of grief. But he wasn't there. At some point I'd crossed over into the kingdom of God, but I didn't know it. I'd met angels, for God's sake, but still I didn't realize where I was. I thought I was in the world where people could take bodies out of tombs too posh for them and dump them on the rubbish heap, and where men beat their wives and kicked the fetuses out of them. I didn't really notice the angels. At least I did, but it didn't sink in. I panicked, you see. All I wanted was him, to dance for him, to hold him for one last time. Something made me turn round. I thought he was the gardener. I asked him whether he'd taken Jesus away. Why in heaven's name would a gardener do such a thing? I wasn't thinking straight. Grief's like that, of course. You think silly things and sometimes you say them out loud. "Mary," he said. "Here I am," I replied. I went to embrace him, to hold him as once he had held me, but you can't get your arms round God. So I took off my sandals for the dance instead. I held out my hands to him. I cannot dance, he said. The nails, he said. You have a limping God now, Mary. Then I will teach you a limping dance, I replied. Once you were my teacher. You taught me how to dance, not that jagged, exhausting dance of my madness and my rage, but the dance of your very particular kind of sanity. The dance of the kingdom of God, you called it. Now I will be your teacher, and after we have done, then I will wash your feet. You taught me how to do that too. And that is how I taught my God to dance.